Welcome to the Fear and Greed Weekend Edition, the week that was, a wrap of the biggest stories over the past 7 days. I'm Sean Aylmer. Well, it was a big week of corporate news. It was the week where Barnaby returned, fickle financial markets all week, and bad news on the COVID front. The local share market had a pretty up and down week, with some big falls overwhelming some decent gains. The market has risen over the past couple of months, but now seems to be finding its range somewhere between 7,200 and 7,300 points. Driving the local market is the economic outlook. That, of course, was dented this week with the outbreak of the Delta variant of COVID-19 in New South Wales. Wall Street was fickle this week. When isn't it? It began having sold down cyclical stocks. Fears of inflation were dominating dispatches, the tech stocks were doing better. Then US President Joe Biden announced a $1 trillion infrastructure plan, and suddenly everything was good again and markets surged. The tech-heavy Nasdaq hit a few new record highs this week. It was a tough week for holders of cryptocurrencies. The value of Bitcoin briefly fell below $30,000 a unit after Beijing said it would crack down on the currencies. One of the big problems for digital currencies is that they use a huge amount of energy to operate, and this week China instructed power companies to stop supplying electricity to crypto providers. One of the great ironies in cryptos is that China has banned their use, but that country powers nearly 80% of global trade in digital tokens. The price of gold has been under $1,800 an ounce all week, and there's not a lot of short-term support for the precious metal. That's a little surprising, given all the talk about inflation, because gold is a store of value and tends to outperform when prices rise. The Aussie dollar fell back to its lowest level since late last year this week. That's mostly reflected the rising greenback, but also the steam has come out of price rises in many commodities. Not that they're falling back, they're just not rising as much. One commodity that is still rising is oil. Anyone that's filled up a tank recently will understand what happens when oil prices rise and the Aussie dollar falls. Petrol gets very, very expensive. And the outlook isn't much better, with OPEC countries only slowly upping supply as the Northern Hemisphere driving season kicks in. Rates. What a week. Commonwealth Bank predicted that the first hike in the official cash rate, which will flow through to mortgage rates, will happen next year, and there'll be 5 increases by September 2023. If you put that into the Fear and Greed calculator, you get a variable home loan mortgage rate of close to 4% in about 2 years' time, up from the current level of 2.69%. The CommBank has already started tightening up lending standards. Westpac also came out and tipped higher rates, though not quite as aggressively as Commonwealth. The Reserve Bank this week said the economy still needs support. It had previously forecast that the next rate rise won't occur until 2024, but along with other regulators, the central bank has written to lenders and told them to keep an eye on things. New South Wales partied, or didn't, like it was 2020 after the number of community-transmitted cases of COVID-19 jumped sharply. It appears to have started when an unmasked limousine driver transporting airline staff caught the Delta variant. It's become known as the Bondi outbreak, centred in Sydney's east. Western Australia, South Australia and Queensland have closed their borders to Sydney-siders, just as the school holidays start. Victoria has also limited visitors from its northern state. The Greater Sydney region, and particularly the inner west and east, have been hit by restrictions, from mask wearing to limits around hospitality and gatherings. Anyone else sick of COVID? Both New South Wales and South Australia outlined big spending budgets through the week, and the former believes it can rein in the deficit within 4 years. Not if COVID keeps spreading. Australia's trade surplus hit a record high of $13.3 billion in May, up 30% on the previous month, thanks to higher exports of iron ore to China. And household wealth also hit a new record during the March quarter. Australia's top diplomat said China had adopted a siege mentality because of its insecurity, and tensions between Beijing and Canberra were likely to continue for some time. In her final speech in the job, the Secretary of the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, Frances Adamson, said China had wound back the clock under President Xi Jinping by prioritising ideology and cutting off a free flow of information. I love it when diplomats talk this frankly. Her comments came just hours before China launched a World Trade Organization complaint against Australia, saying anti-dumping tariffs were unfairly imposed on stainless steel kitchen sinks, railway wheels, whatever they are, and wind towers. Canberra is not happy. There was the story this week about superannuation and the reduction in take-home pay most of us will feel from next week when the superannuation surcharge increases from 9.5% to 10%. This week, ANZ Bank warned the finance sector union to stop misleading employees or face legal action after the union launched a petition urging the bank to change its mind and fund the increase in the guarantee. The fact is that most employers aren't funding the increased super payment, and when you get your next pay packet, you may well have less to spend, and that's bad for the economy. And there was a pretty incredible story this week about staff shortages hampering businesses. In short, there aren't enough applicants for jobs, and those that do apply often don't have the right skills. Good luck finding hospitality workers, sales staff, engineering and science professionals, and drivers. International border closures, uncertain economic conditions, and job location were all reasons why it was difficult to find staff. More traditional concerns among workers, things like pay, conditions, working hours, they were all well down the list of priorities. In overseas news, ultra-conservative cleric Ebrahim Raisi won Iran's presidential election, putting new doubt over nuclear talks with the US, which was expected to see Iran return to global oil markets. Indonesia's Garuda Airlines, which 10 days ago was suspended from the Jakarta exchange for not paying its bills, lost $3.3 billion last year, and is considering dropping routes, including Jakarta to Sydney. The airline has already said it will stop flights to Melbourne and Perth next month. France and Germany said they want to work more closely with Russia, and according to media reports, their leaders Angela Merkel and Emmanuel Macron want to invite Vladimir Putin to a summit with European Union leaders. The relationship between the EU and Moscow has been frosty, shall we say, since 2014, when all summits were cancelled after Russia annexed Crimea. And Hong Kong's pro-democracy Apple Daily newspaper closed after authorities used a national security law to arrest its top editors and freeze the company's assets. Its last print edition hit the streets on Thursday. There was plenty of corporate news around this week. Commonwealth Bank announced the sale of its general insurance business to South Africa's Hollard Group for about $1 billion. It ends a 3-year clean-up by Chief Executive Matt Comyn that leaves CBA as a focused retail and business bank. Australia's biggest lender now has a growing pile of surplus capital and franking credits on its balance sheet. What's that mean? Well, for shareholders, that could mean buybacks or it could mean big dividends. Boral Group sold its US building products business for $2.9 billion, unwinding an expansion that ultimately cost Chief Executive Mike Kane his job. Boral bought the then Headwaters business for $3.5 billion in 2016, but then rolled out a series of profit downgrades. Boral's share price jumped above $7 on the announcement, the first time since 2018, though fell back later in the week. Meanwhile, Seven Group dropped all conditions on its bid for the building company, a bid that is pitched lower than Boral's current trading price and one which its board has already rejected. Some of the biggest property groups in the country revalued their portfolios this week. The changes reflect demographic and social changes. For example, Vicinity Centres cut its valuation of Australia's biggest shopping centre, Chadstone, in Melbourne, because people aren't using malls like they used to. But Dexus increased the value of its industrial and office portfolio, reflecting the popularity of supply chain buildings. That's not surprising in an e-commerce world. Two of Australia's oldest listed investment houses said they'd merged to create an $11 billion powerhouse on the ASX. Washington H. Soul Pattinson's and Milton Limited will combine to become the second largest listed equity fund. Together, they'll be a very large investor on the Australian Stock Exchange, holding significant sway over boards and management, remuneration reports, and strategies. And the local market got a new top 100 company when Endeavour Group listed. The demerger of Woolworths gaming and liquor businesses, which includes Dan Murphy's and BWS, hundreds of pubs and thousands of gaming machines, created a company worth $11 billion. Now I get to the point in the program where I go through the biggest story of the week, the sleeper story, the most remarkable story, and my favourite story. The biggest story of the week was Barnaby. The big man is back, leading the National Party, pestering all and sundry. Barnaby Joyce is a divisive figure in Australian politics. He had an affair with a staffer, resulting in a child. He lost his gig as Deputy Prime Minister and Leader of the Nationals. The two are now together and, judging from the pictures this week, happy, so good on them. But it's not a good look for the leader of the most conservative major party in the country. Barnaby is an adept political performer at times. Opposition leader Anthony Albanese felt that this week. But he's also a bit of a loose cannon. And within 48 hours of his ascension over former Nats leader Michael McCormack, the Prime Minister had wildfires on climate change and the Murray-Darling Basin plan flaring. One thing about Barnaby, he's impossible to ignore. The sleeper story of the week was about mobile phone costs. Customers are paying between 5 and 15% more for their service from the big three providers since the merger of TPG Telecom and Vodafone Hutchison, according to the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. The $15 billion merger was opposed at the time by the ACCC, but it went ahead after a court challenge. Competition boss Rod Sims said customers now have a choice of 3 lookalike telcos who account for 90% of the market, raise prices in lockstep, and don't compete on price. It's a bit of a sleeper because not much was made of it, but it shows just what happens when competition is removed from the marketplace. The most remarkable story this week involved Crown Resorts. The Victorian Royal Commission just keeps unearthing incredible tales. This week, it included allegations that Chair Helen Coonan kept her knowledge of a potential $167 million tax bill from other directors. Claims that a confidant of major shareholder James Packer had organised the journalist to be followed, and remarkable revelations that the gaming group could have aided money laundering worth $160 million using its Crown credit cards. The revelations never cease to amaze, and this organisation has a long way to go to win over the confidence of Commissioner Ray Finkelstein. My favourite story this week was the sale of Miranda Downs, the 438,000-hectare station in Queensland's Gulf of Carpentaria. It went for more than $180 million, setting a new record for a single pastoral holding in Australia. Miranda Downs includes 55,000 head of cattle and a 6,000 megalitre water licence from the Gilbert River. Why is it my favourite story? I like that rural landowners are doing well, and there's something pretty incredible thinking about any property with 55,000 cattle, but mostly it's because at heart, I'm just a bushie. Moving on to this week's interviews, Monday's interview was with Chris Breike, Chief Executive of online investment advisor StockSpot. We had a great chat about the best performing exchange-traded funds, the novel ETFs, and the most popular. On Tuesday, I spoke to Rachel Newman, an experienced startup investor, about her new venture capital fund, Flying Fox. Tim Harcourt, the one and only airport economist, was my guest on Wednesday. We talked about all things trade, including the recent deal between Australia and the United Kingdom. Thursday's interview was a look at a David and Goliath battle that's played out in the federal court over the last few months. We spoke to Dr. Mel Marquis about a family-owned company from regional Victoria accused by the ACCC of operating as a cartel, and what makes the case interesting is that the family-owned business beat the regulator. And then on Friday, I spoke to Nine Network's political editor Chris Uhlmann, all about Barnaby. It certainly was a strange week in Canberra, and Chris had great insight into what was going on. That's it for the Week in Review. Tomorrow morning, we're chatting to Deborah Coram from compliance platform SafeTrack about modern slavery, what it looks like, and what Australian businesses need to do to comply with the law. If you missed any of them, all our interviews are permanently available in the Fear and Greed playlist or at fearandgreed.com.au. And if you're stuck in lockdown, why wouldn't you listen? I'm Sean Aylmer. Have a good Saturday and a great weekend.